Thank you, everybody, for joining us. For those who don't know me, I'm Catherine O'Regan, the Executive Director of Sydney Business Chamber. And it is coming to the close of a big year, but I do want to thank each and every one of you. We were doing a little bit of a tally over the last months of how we've been doing these online forums, and we've run nearly about 50 of these, and we've engaged coming up to about 1,600 people one way or another on these online forums. Before we kickstart, I do want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and that's the land of which I'm on, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. But I do think it's highly appropriate. This is our last online or formal online forum for the year, and it's fantastic to have a leading journalist with us who I know you've got, Jennifer, a very broad background and cover a broad range of topics today, from politics and economics through to anything else that you'd like to lead us into. But as I said, it is fantastic to come into the end of the year and to do a bit of a reflection piece today on the year that was, and maybe even some predictions to 2021. But today we have Jennifer Hewett, and for those who don't know Jennifer, she is the National Affairs columnist for the Australian Financial Review, and really been in the game for 30 years. So it does come with that deep and, as I said, broad experience. So thank you very much, Jennifer, for joining us today. But maybe just to kick things off, I'd really love to hear about what your view is happening on the national perspective. It's interesting when you hear, the Federal Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, get up and say, back then we were in a recession and then suddenly we're out of the recession. What's your sense of how do we get there? And is the economy really resilient? And can we turn around that quickly? Have we done the right thing with all those different levers? Give us a bit of a summation around our national economic environment.
Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be here. The Prime Minister this morning said just as much when he was addressing the Coalition Party room, but what he said was that the government had promised a safer, economically stronger and more stable Australia, and that it had largely delivered, which is interesting. He wasn't trying to say that there wasn't a long way to go and there weren't lots and lots of challenges. Well, we certainly know about that. But in that typical way of his, he praised what he called the quiet Australians, to work together, to build their businesses, to do their jobs and survive and be kind to one another, to help one another, etc. He said Australians had, I thought, an interesting word, cleaved together this year. One of the things that this year has demonstrated, so rather dramatically and often, I think, unfortunately, at Canberra's expense, has been the power of the state governments. Everything from energy policy to border closures to public health, states are asserting their own authority, and I kind of think they're not really wanting to retreat from that, and it's also, of course, it's proved rather popular with their voters. So, for example, this week, in fact yesterday, we've heard all about the downgrading of both New South Wales and Victoria's credit ratings from S&P. Victoria was downgraded 2 notches to AA, and New South Wales to AA+. Victoria, I think, was expected. New South Wales was a bit more of a surprise, given I think the New South Wales government has not been, not only did it not have the same terrible lockdown that Victoria had for so many months, but I think you saw the difference also in approach in the recent state budgets, where the Victorian government was, they were both obviously spending up big, but the Victorian government was much more focused, I think, on public sector spending and not really doing much for the private sector. In contrast, for example, in New South Wales, they said that debt would rise, but New South Wales still has a higher degree of flexibility and some potential upside to projections due to possible asset sales and expenditure reviews. In other words, they think Dominic Perrottet will be a lot more effective at curbing spending. But the question, of course, the big question has been this year is how much all this debt really matters, in an era of low interest rates. So I think you see relatively modest changes to industrial relations, which of course are being unleashed this week as an example of that, and certainly even the tax system is another. So, rather than attempting yet again to get, major tax cuts through, it's doing things like accelerated depreciation and helping homeowners and builders with renovations and construction grants. I mean, the government prides itself really on not having big policy fights, but really on just kind of doing smaller incremental measures which will get through. I guess I think 2021 will be very different to 2020, and hopefully, with the vaccine, but coming at least, in the second half of the year more widely. But I still think it's going to be a very difficult year, and there is no clear path ahead. I think what this year has taught us that expert predictions are not necessarily going to give you much confidence that they'll actually eventuate.
Do you think the National Cabinet has worked in our favour? I mean, it seems to be going pretty smoothly, then it kind of fell apart, then it sort of came back. What's your assessment of, is that here to stay? Is that better than the COAG system that was around before?
Yeah, well, I certainly think it's better than the COAG system that was around before, but I mean, that is not a particularly high bar. I mean, that was where people would say that's where quality ideas, go to die in COAG. At least it's less bureaucratic than COAG. It therefore is capable of being more transparent, and it's capable of getting quicker action. But what I do think has happened is that it means that really states and state governments are very pleased at their idea that they can kind of control their own destiny, meanwhile being funded by Canberra a lot of the time.
And you made a point earlier around the different approaches between New South Wales and Victoria. Here in New South Wales, infrastructure-led recovery, and I think you sort of more of it enabling the private sector rather than Victoria. Tell us a little bit more about.
Well, obviously there's very, very big infrastructure bills in both states, and that is certainly not confined to New South Wales. But the difference is that, we've had New South Wales in the past, they've had sales of assets to kind of help pay for it, and whereas Victoria not only doesn't tend to do that, its public sector has grown and grown and grown, and even pre-COVID, and its spending, and that has greatly accelerated again during this year. The Victorian government in general, and it was very obvious, I think, also in its response to the pandemic, its relations with the whole business community were not good. Its communications with them were not good. Very, very different to New South Wales.
This year was also, the US election. Do you think of Biden? What's he up to these days? He's going to say everyone's going to be wearing masks. Is he going to have to force some of these restrictions that we're now, easing back on?
Well, just like Australia, of course, the states are a federal system, and the power of the states is very, very strong, possibly stronger, I think, even than the state governments here. And so, of course, different states can try and enforce different things and encourage things. But, for example, they would never close their borders. They might discourage people from coming, but they can never actually enforce closure of their borders. They can never enforce wearing masks. It's so out of control there. It will obviously, a Biden administration can certainly help around the edges, but I don't think there's going to be any great improvement, even with lockdowns in places like California, or effective lockdowns, until there's a vaccine that's widely available.
What's your assessment about what's happening with the China trade sanctions? What we're hearing now, it's meat, it's lobster, it's barley, it's wine.
Australia, in some ways, I guess, is fortunate in that their key export is iron ore, and because China can't get that anywhere else, particularly given Brazil's problems, both with the collapse of its tailings dam and the virus. So in the short term, I think the iron ore industry continues to, go from strength to strength. This has been going on for a few years. It's, really the deep freeze in diplomatic relations started back at the end of 3 years ago, the end of 2017 under Malcolm Turnbull. But it's certainly gotten a lot worse. And I think it's a huge worry. And I understand the government saying, well, we must stand up for our national interest. What could we possibly accede to on any of these, demands that we must change? But I think needn't have gotten to quite that point of open confrontation.
But there's no overarching strategy that China must be thinking about here. Is it to really test Australia's capability, or to almost test China's capability to influence and change?
Well, I do think it's also using Australia as an example. But, Australia is it's more vulnerable. It's very much more vulnerable than many other countries because it's so dependent on trade with China. And so it can be kind of made to be an example with that kind of reverberates quite a lot.
So do you think we will see some further industries having difficulty around the trade sanction and the export? It's almost like picking off.
Yes, I do.
One by one.
Yes, I do. And I think it's a really big problem, a huge problem. But there's very little now that could be done about it because it's become such a question of face, really, for both sides. But with China, having less interest than Australia does, clearly, in lowering the temperature.
So our key is to find new markets. Nothing's going to replace that level?
No, nothing's going to replace it. Nothing's going to replace it quickly. This is very difficult. I remember speaking to the former Premier of WA, Colin Barnett, the other day, and he said, look, these calls are just to expand, to diversify your markets. Well, of course people try and do it, but it's naive to think that is going to be possible in the short term. But also, given the size of the Chinese market, building up other markets, one will take time, and two, it's not really, an easy replacement.
The other one, which I think will be interesting, is energy. And we know that Prime Minister Scott Morrison has come out and said, we're actually thinking we're going to abandon our use of the carryover credits. What do you think's happening there? Is a change? Is this a strategic shift in terms of approach around energy, climate change that's coming?
Well, it's kind of it's in many ways it's just being the politics is being kind of carried along on the wave of technology change and the falling price of renewables, which then undermines the business case for coal. A big debate about the role of gas in all of that. But of course, then the state governments are going further. Now, the Morrison government would say that Australia says very proudly, Australia always does over delivers, under promises, over delivers. That's their view of this, and that now that they are doing so well, they will not need the Kyoto targets, which was kind of like the little buffer they had before. The question, of course, is that everyone, not only states, Australian states, but most other countries and certainly other trading partners are all getting on board with saying we will be net zero emissions by 2050. And so this has become a kind of a big political cry. And of course, the Australian government says, well, that's all very well, including from businesses as well. They don't have a clue how they're going to get there. And they, so Australia does not say that without a clear plan of how we're going to get there. We'll get there, but then they've changed it a bit. They now say as soon as possible because they know that the kind of politics is running against them on this. But one of the issues seems to be that they argue that if they made a commitment on 2050, they would have to have a credible plan, which very few others have, to actually get emissions down much more dramatically by 2030. Because Australia is committed to 26 to 28% reduction on 2005 levels by 2030, and that will obviously be achieved. But according to Angus Taylor, it would require like a 43% reduction by 2030, which of course is very close to what Labor took to the last election and the government, completely attacked. And they say technology will get us there in the end, but it won't necessarily be linear. That it'll actually be easier in the 2030s than it is in the 2020s, for example. Now but the pressure is definitely on, and the pressure will definitely come from the Biden administration. That'll be a very big issue for it. So I'm not certainly going to predict that Australia will stick to its current position on 2050. it's obviously already softened its rhetoric. I'm not quite sure where that'll go.
A little bit more incrementalism, maybe, that's happening there.
Yeah, but I mean, for example, New South Wales has, they've just put in a massive plan. So in a sense, the national electricity market has been overtaken by states doing their own thing. And in New South Wales, the big issue, of course, is gas, where I think you've got a New South Wales minister who simply, Matt Keane, who just does not believe that gas will have a major role to play as firming power, which is exactly the opposite of what the federal government believes.
And there was a little bit of tension between the Prime Minister and Minister Keane way back around who knows more about energy policy. So, yes. So I'm sure some of that tension will continue.
Well, the education system, of course, is very broad. I was just writing today about the school system, and I think the problems in Australia's education system start there really. But if we and I think that is a real problem for Australia, the declining standards in literacy and numeracy. There's all sorts of reasons for that, but from the beginning, I think that's a big issue, and I don't think we've yet to address it. I don't think states have yet to address it properly. Whether they will, I mean, I don't know. But I think all our understanding of ourselves as an education, our proud claims to be an education nation, are really quite hollow. And although obviously there's always fantastic students, outstanding teachers, the mass in the middle, I think, is a big problem. And getting the best out of them, I don't think our current system allows for that. In terms of universities, again, they relied, I think, on a very badly flawed model. I think the outcomes, again, have been bad for a lot of students, not all students, obviously, but for a lot of domestic students. And one of the things, the reliance on international students, where Australia, just started this probably, 15 years ago or so, or maybe even a bit more, and then became a country unlike any other in terms of the percentage of international students sometimes in classes. Sometimes in classes that would be the absolute majority would be international students, particularly in kind of commerce, business areas. So this was great for the university books because they had been starved of funds, and it meant that they could also, cross-subsidise then their research, which could get them up the rankings more, which means that they could get more international students, which means that this was this kind of lovely, circuitous circle as far as they were concerned, and they'd therefore build more big buildings that would attract more international students. But the actual teaching standards for domestic students, I think, were often really badly lacking. And the universities, of course, will say they had no choice because their funding was just not enough. Their public funding from students and from the government, domestic students, was not adequate. Well, I think the fact that we maybe Chinese students will return in the numbers that they were. I think there's a lot of reason to be dubious about that now, particularly because of the political climate. But in a sense, I don't think that's a bad thing. And it will force the universities and the government to reassess how they're actually going to fund this, whether the universities are being, whether they could be more effective, more efficient, whether they need more public funding. None of this has really kind of happened so far. And of course, there's always should be a high level of engagement, a high level of interaction, and it's great to have international students. But I think it just went too far. And some university vice-chancellors would say to me, oh no, this is great for interaction. But I said, have you spoken to any students? Or because in fact, in many courses, there was very little interaction. Compared to, say, one of the big London universities I spoke to a couple of years ago, they had very strict percentages of students that were allowed, of international students, then they made very deliberate efforts to mix them up. You know, they'd put an international student in a college in a room with a domestic student, whereas we didn't do any of that. So I think we kind of took what seemed to be a very financially attractive option, and I think it's going to come back to bite universities. Sorry to be a little negative on this point.
No, it's true. Because there are a number, I think we've got some universities with us today, and, you know, that sort of being overweight around the dependency on international students is definitely having, making them have a rethink on their policy. And I think Michael Spence has put a couple of, comments publicly about what can happen. What do you see the sector needing to do to get a little bit more balance in their revenue model? Because the federal government's also changed how they're going to.
Yes, and frankly, none of that makes much sense either. I mean, that's not going to suddenly alter things. The fact that we have HEX is a good thing, but it means that people are not immediately responsive to changes, and also, you're not suddenly going to want to major in maths if you've never really done it at school. And that, again, that's that whole issue of it. It starts much earlier in our education system. I do think we've gone for, Australian universities are much bigger than most universities in the world. I mean, tens and tens of thousands of people, 70,000 or so in some cases. I think that's too big. And I also think that there's got to be far more of an emphasis on having the researchers and tenured professors and things actually teaching the students. At the moment, I don't think that happens nearly to the degree it should. Smaller classes, how they're going to manage to get funding for that, I don't know. But I think at the moment we've emphasised quantity over quality for a lot of the teaching. And the result has been that, in a sense, we're now going to be getting rid of some of the quantity, but the quality is also going to go down because it means that a lot of the people are being let go. Yeah. So I'm not sure what the answer is on that. I do think there'll have to be some more public funding, but I also think that universities themselves will have to prove that they can make more efficient use of their own academic resources, as well as link. And this has been an ongoing thing all the time, a debate in Australia about, for a lot of the research, linking more closely with Australian businesses, and it just never seems to actually get anywhere.
It is a challenge, and we did have a couple of sessions throughout the year on that, the whole R&D and the business link with that, and every university I think is doing that to the best of their extent, but getting that to work, whether there's even federal government CRCs, trying to get these cooperative.
And of course, sometimes it does, sometimes it works, but and that's good, but it's still not as pervasive as you would hope. I spoke to a business leader last night who'd just come from yet another meeting on how to get more cooperation between universities. I'm so sick of this. We just talk all the time. Just say what would be better to how business should change and can think about changing if that's the case. But we don't. All we do is talk about it.
Yep. Okay. Well, I'm going to put that on my to-do list and see if we can encourage more, because it is. There are some businesses who say they're actively doing it with certain universities, but whether those people don't know, or whether it's you just need the sort of bit more critical mass to do it. But it's definitely, as you say, a conversation that keeps going round in circles. But I do want to sort of start to think about a lot of the comments that we've talked about today is this relationship between business, government, the general citizenry and government. And way back, I think we had a session around trust. And so I think our views on trust now might be different to what the views were in the beginning of the year. But what sort of rating would you give, and how are people trusting government now? How do you think they're trusting politicians now or business now? And so has that changed, do you think, over the year?
I think it has changed a bit for the year, and I'm glad it has. I think that there wasn't. It wasn't just the decline in trust in government, although that was obviously very pronounced. It was a decline in trust in authority institutions of all sorts, really, including the church for obvious reasons, and even kind of many community organisations, just the things that used to hold us together as a glue. The whole people, it was just easier to be very kind of impatient with it and to not trust it. And I do think that social media gets blamed for a lot of things, and I certainly don't think it's the only cause, but I think that didn't help in terms of getting the level of complaint, the kind of ability to appeal to angry voices didn't help. I think when things were looking very scary, however, because of the pandemic, and of course, to use the unprecedented challenges, people did look to government and wanted reassurance, control. Australians loved, of course, to pride themselves on being, fiercely independent and stuff. But actually, I think they're kind of quite obedient, really, and follow directions most of the time. Very yes, if compared to Americans, for example, en masse. So I think because, and I think that's been then reinforced by the ability to control the virus after a few, near disasters and mishaps, and be able to close the borders and things, and then even in Victoria, which of course was such a fiasco, even though the whole place had to be locked down, and many people didn't like and didn't think that was necessary, including many people in business and the way it was done or the way it was kept for so long, most people still went, well, see, it worked, and so that level of trust that the government can not only protect them, but also make life a bit easier. Certainly not for everyone, but with programs like JobKeeper, I think were incredibly important in restoring the trust. And then, of course, with the state governments, closing their borders, etc., when necessary or when they considered it necessary, I think people were looking for somebody to help, and that was what made them popular. Now, of course, once you get past an emergency and a crisis, and then it's what have you done for me lately? We might see that level of trust begin to disintegrate a bit. You probably will. Just back on that thing in terms of the difference of the state governments, I thought it was actually fascinating. New South Wales was clear that that the Prime Minister, if you think back this time last year, it was fairly obvious. Scott Morrison and Gladys Berejiklian were having a little bit of a tension between them over the bushfires. But over this year, of course, he came to rely on her absolutely to set. He kept talking about New South Wales as the gold standard, and there were two reasons for that. One was that New South Wales investment in public health over many years it meant that it was far better placed to control. Do the contact tracing, be able to kind of get on top of of outbreaks whenever they occurred. But it was also the Premier's absolute insistence that you had to balance the economic crisis as well as the health crisis, and that you could do both. And that really, she was the only Premier who was saying that. And that was very, very important. Now, just imagine if New South Wales had shut down in the same way that Victoria did. I mean, our economy would be looking very different now.
Yeah, it has been a challenge. And maybe thinking about, we've talked a fair bit around the government, both we have the government here in New South Wales and the Scott Morrison Liberal government or coalition government in Canberra. But thinking about federal Labor Party, you made a little reference to that in your sort of opening comments. They've got their own ructions that are happening there, with Joel Fitzgibbon deciding to move away a little bit. What are some of the thoughts or predictions you think will happen there? But they're sort of going to work themselves out in the back room and then change leaders, or we're here for a while yet? No,
I think they're going to change leaders, really. And I think the only reason they didn't change leaders now was because that nobody could agree on who it should be. So, but of course the problems go a lot deeper than the leadership, and I mean, in many ways you'd have to feel sorry for Albanese because of all those things that we've talked about, and everybody looking to government. I mean, it's governments everywhere that people have been basically supportive of. in terms of re-electing them and backing them. And oppositions have had a much, much harder time. I mean, look at the Liberal opposition in Victoria. I mean, that's just a disaster, for example. But I think but Labor's problems are much deeper, and again, the idea of somebody kind of is leaving the front bench is just indicative, the most dramatic example of that. And this whole problem or division between what are known as the progressive left and the people who came. Well, what happened to all those mine workers and blue collar workers that we used to support, and how come we've just forgotten about them? That of course also does play out in the the energy sphere in terms of coal and gas workers, etc. But it's still, again, it's even broader than that. And I don't think it's impossible to unite them, but at the moment the centre ground in the Labor Party just seems to have disappeared, and it's kind of more polarised between these two forces, and that's where Morrison has been much better at sticking to the centre, which given in a system of compulsory voting, which we have in Australia, tends to be where elections are won and lost. And so that I mean, I know everybody got sick of hearing that last year, but I thought it was interesting today that he resurrected his quiet Australians, as the people he's trying to address, and in those outer suburban areas, which he now thinks he can claim those people, and many people blue collar workers who think that Labor's no longer speaking to them very much. So that's the divisions that's going on in the Labor Party.
Yeah, and I haven't heard that term for a while, the quiet Australians. Yeah. It has resurrected itself, hasn't it? Well, as you say, probably deliberately.
Yes.
Yeah, and I don't know if we're going to be that quiet as we come into Christmas and we've got a little bit more freedom and we're encouraged to, holiday at home. How do you see that economic recovery happening? You talked earlier about it being it's going to be a bit of a hard slog and a long tail with that economic, we've got to pay the debt somehow, so that economic return, because we'll have a federal budget in May.
Yes.
So how do you see some of the things playing out economically over the 2021 period? Is there a lot more government spending going to happen, say, in that budget, or is that going to be moderated, targeted to the quiet Australians?
Well, I think it will be moderated. I mean, in the sense that you've already seen that happening with the JobKeeper, tapering of JobKeeper payments and things. But there's still going to be a lot of spending. There's no question that, the Morrison government is not going to suddenly say, come the May budget, oh well, we're past the worst now, so we'll all have to tighten our belts and remember that deficits are a very, very bad idea. That's going to be a much longer term proposition. I think really the test will be how sensibly that money is spent, and it certainly is the ambition of the federal government to use it to unleash more private sector investment, business investment, but of course that was not high pre-pandemic. There was a lot of argument about that not being, was kind of just motoring along. So you've seen, some changes to the tax system. They're obviously going to be introducing some changes to the IR system, to the industrial relations system, and it's certainly not all that business would want, for example, but it's an improvement as far as everybody's concerned. Now, whether or not that's going to be enough for Australia to lift its productivity again, I don't know. We as I said, with the iron ore, we continue to be very fortunate at that for the next few years. So therefore, you've kind of got that opportunity. But the idea of the manufacturing recovery, lead recovery, gas-led recovery in manufacturing, that seems overly optimistic, I would say. But there's no doubt that many Australian businesses, can be very ingenious, that they can work their way through things, innovative, all those things. And if we had a slightly less sclerotic industrial relations system, that would help. But I think there'll have to be a lot that goes right, and I do think China is a big problem. But I think the level of unemployment will kind of drift down a bit, so that's good. And clearly people are feeling more optimistic, and Frydenberg is feeling much more optimistic about the economy than a few months ago.
Yeah, and confidence. You mentioned that earlier as well, this is a confidence game, whether it's business confidence, consumer confidence, government confidence in their own ambitions and capability.
Well, I mean, for example, if you look at, when I talked about expert predictions as well, I mean, I was speaking to a real estate agent the other day, and he said, can we just have no economists ever speak about real estate prices in Sydney ever again? Because they always get it wrong. And so, now you've seen, obviously, everybody kind of rushing out to buy houses again. Now, is this yes, we'll have asset inflation. Is that a really good idea? No. But Philip Lowe at the moment says, well, it doesn't really matter. It's not really a big problem. But we just need to get unemployment down. But you can feel it building again, and how much of a bubble that is. You kind of keep thinking Australia can't keep relying on this, but anyway, that's what we seem to be doing at the moment.
Let's think about the year ahead. What are a couple of things you'd like to see happen? And I don't mind if that's economically, politically, or socially. I will never hold you to these. They don't have to be predictions, just things you'd like to see.
I'd like to see more of a return to offices and to universities and things. Now, I think it's going to be true that we're not going to return in the way that we did. I think a lot of people appreciate that it's great to have, at least a day or two at home. And technology, again, makes that far more feasible than it ever has been in the past. But I do think people have also recognised that there's a great cost, a social cost, but just a collaborative cost to not being in the office at least a few days a week, probably 3 to 4, 2 to 3, depending. So I think that's going to be a much bigger improvement. I mean, in Victoria, that's not happened at all. It's much more so still in Sydney. But I think kind of working that out will be really, really interesting. I think politically, I don't think we'll have an election next year, an early election. I think Morrison's idea will still be to kind of, even though he might be going very well, I think it'll still be to continue very much to 2022. That seems a long way away. And I think China will continue to be, that's a big problem, and for Australia in particular. And I think that's going to be the undercurrent. But in general, I think the government will continue on its way, and it won't hesitate to spend a bit more money if it thinks that's what the economy needs. So I think it won't be this generation will be paying for it. In a sense, it'll be, or certainly this political cycle. And the other thing I think we're going to see, and I think it's a good thing to see, is that, you'll finally get greater agreement on energy policy, despite, all the political arguments and things. So, like, again, technology just obliterates a lot of them. A lot of those differences. So that's a good thing, but it will be an expensive thing. I mean, when people talk about renewables being cheaper, that is all true. What is not cheaper is transmission costs.
Yeah, I agree. That's a very good point. On that note, we'll hold it there. And I think you've taken us on a very interesting journey, but summed up, there's sometimes I think with all our borders closed, we look inwards and and then that introspectivity is not always good. So you've brought us back out. We are still a nation, though isolated, has to play in that international dynamic, whether it's on climate change, whether it's on international students, whether it's on trade. So whilst I think while we're having our beautiful holiday at home and spending enough money in our local regions and keeping our economy going, so when the dynamic changes a little bit, we can still kickstart that economy, pay some of the debt back and enjoy all the things that we love about our country and our city. But thank you very much, Jennifer, sharing your insights and thoughts there and views, and I'm sure there'll be some good reading over the summer months to continue to hear what you have to say. But thank you everybody likewise for joining us online. It's been Fantastic. We are going to resume some of our face-to-face forums next year, but we've also discovered, like many things, we can do it online as well. We may just try and get a bit of a balance between both, so you can get the interaction but also get to see and hear things in a medium, which you can do now or save it for later. So everybody, please stay safe. Take some time for your family, your friends and your loved ones, and we look forward to seeing you in what will be, touch wood, a better 2021. And thank you, Jennifer, once again.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.